The knock was so weak that at first I thought I had imagined it. Dawn was just beginning to creep through the windows, the house still wrapped in that quiet space between night and morning. I wasn't expecting anyone. Then the knock came again, slow, uneven, almost desperate. My heart tightened as I walked toward the door, a strange fear rising in my chest before I even knew why. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. My pregnant daughter stood there, barefoot, shivering, her face pale and hollow like all the life had been drained out of her. One hand clutched her swollen belly, the other braced against the doorframe as if she might collapse at any second. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Mom, please help me." In that instant, I knew she hadn't just come for comfort, she was running for her life. As I pulled her inside and wrapped my arms around her, I felt how light she was, how her body shook with exhaustion and fear. This was the same daughter who had laughed about baby names just weeks ago, who had told me her husband was excited to become a father, who insisted everything was fine whenever I asked if she was truly happy. I had believed her because I wanted to believe her. Standing there in the early morning light, holding her as she struggled to breathe through silent sobs, the truth hit me harder than any words ever could. Something terrible had been happening behind closed doors, and I had been blind to it. As I helped her sit down and brought her water, my mind raced with questions I was almost afraid to ask. What could drive a pregnant woman to flee her home before sunrise? What kind of man makes the mother of his unborn child run in fear? And most painfully of all, how long had she been suffering alone? I didn't know it yet, but as the sun rose that morning, the story she was about to tell would shatter everything I thought I knew about her marriage, about trust, and about how close danger can live to love. She sat on the edge of the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her breathing shallow and uneven, as if her lungs had forgotten how to work normally. Dawn light filtered through the curtains, revealing details I hadn't fully seen in the darkness: scratches on her arms, dirt on her feet, dried tears on her cheeks. I brought her warm water, my hands trembling so badly I spilled some on the floor, and watched as she took slow, careful sips. Her other hand never left her stomach, moving in small circles as if she were reassuring the baby that everything would be okay. That single gesture broke me more than anything else. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She was protecting a life growing inside her. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The house felt heavy, like it was holding its breath with us. I didn't want to push her, but the silence was unbearable. Finally, in a voice barely louder than the ticking clock on the wall, she said, "I couldn't stay anymore." Those 5 words carried more pain than any scream. I moved closer, sitting beside her, close enough that she could feel my presence without feeling trapped. "You're safe now," I whispered, even though part of me was terrified of saying it out loud, afraid I might be lying without knowing it. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor as she began to talk, slowly at first, as if each word had to fight its way out. She described the argument that started the night before, something small and ordinary: dinner being late, a comment said the wrong way. "It always started like that," she said. Small things that exploded without warning. This time, when she tried to walk away, he blocked the door. When she told him she was tired and pregnant and needed to rest, his voice changed. That was the moment she knew things were going to get bad. She stopped herself there, swallowing hard, her face tightening as if the memory itself caused physical pain. I wanted to interrupt, to tell her she didn't have to go on, but she shook her head slightly. "If I stop," she said, "I might never finish," so I listened. I listened as she explained how fear had become a constant companion in that house, how even silence felt dangerous. She talked about the way he watched her, questioned her, controlled where she went and who she spoke to. I felt sick realizing how many times she had defended him to me, how often I had accepted her reassurances without pushing further. Each memory felt like a quiet accusation, not from her, but from my own conscience. When she finally described the moment she decided to leave, her voice broke completely. He had shouted something about the baby, something cruel and careless, and in that instant, a switch flipped inside her. She said she felt a clarity she had never felt before, not courage exactly, but urgency. A deep, instinctive understanding that if she didn't leave now, she might not leave at all. She waited until he fell asleep, every second stretching like an hour, afraid even to breathe too loudly. She packed nothing. There was no time, no space for hesitation. She grabbed her phone, her keys, and wrapped a jacket around herself, even though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely zip it up. As she spoke, I imagined her moving through that dark house, every step heavy with fear, listening for any sound that might mean she had been discovered. She told me how her heart pounded so hard she thought it might wake him. How she kept one hand over her belly, whispering apologies to the baby for every jolt, every stumble. When she finally stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a shock, but it also felt like freedom. A terrifying, fragile freedom. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The walk to my house felt endless, she said. Her body ached, her feet burned, and panic kept telling her she was making a mistake, that he would come after her, that she wouldn't make it. More than once, she thought about sitting down on the curb and giving up. But then the baby moved, a small reminder that she wasn't alone, and she forced herself to keep going. By the time she reached my door, she was exhausted, barely standing, running on nothing but fear and determination. When she finished speaking, the room felt unbearably quiet. I realized I had been holding my breath. My first instinct was anger, hot, overwhelming, almost blinding. I wanted to drive to his house, to confront him, to demand answers, to make him feel even a fraction of the fear he had caused. But beneath that anger was something deeper and heavier, guilt. Guilt for not seeing the signs. Guilt for not asking harder questions. Guilt for trusting that love alone would keep my daughter safe. I took her hands in mine, noticing how cold they were, and said the words I should have said long ago. You did the right thing. She looked up at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time since she arrived, I saw tears spill freely down her face. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had been holding back, but raw, shaking sobs. She leaned into me like she used to as a child, and I held her, rocking her gently, as if I could somehow rock the fear out of her body. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just the beginning of her escape, it was the beginning of a long, painful journey toward healing. I didn't know what steps we would need to take, who we would need to call, or how dangerous the days ahead might be. All I knew was that my daughter had come to me at dawn, broken and terrified, and I would not let her face what came next alone. Later that morning, after she finally drifted into a restless sleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched cup of tea. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves had learned a terrible secret. Every memory replayed in my mind with new meaning, every visit where she seemed quieter, every phone call cut short, every excuse she made for not coming home. I realized how carefully she had protected us from the truth, how much effort it must have taken to pretend everything was fine while living in constant fear. That realization hurt almost as much as the story she had just told me. When she woke up, her eyes were swollen, her face drawn with exhaustion. I asked if she was hungry, and she shook her head. But I made her eat a little anyway, reminding her softly that she had to think about the baby now. She nodded, obedient but distant, as if part of her was still somewhere else, as she slowly ate. She began talking again, this time about the early days of her marriage. Her voice was steadier, almost numb, like she was recounting someone else's life. She told me how charming he had been at first, attentive, affectionate, always saying the right things. He brought flowers for no reason, checked in on her throughout the day, told everyone how lucky he was to have her, even when I had my small doubts. I brushed them aside because nothing looked obviously wrong. She said that's how it always starts. Control doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It disguises itself as care. Little by little, the rules began to appear. He didn't like certain friends. He questioned why she needed to visit family so often. He criticized her clothes, her tone of voice, the way she laughed. At first, she adjusted without complaint, telling herself this was just part of marriage: compromise, patience, understanding. When she pushed back, even gently, he accused her of not appreciating him, of trying to embarrass him, of being ungrateful, and slowly, without even realizing it, she became smaller. Her pregnancy should have been a time of joy, she said, but instead it intensified everything. He became more possessive, more unpredictable. He controlled her doctor visits, demanded to know every detail, questioned every decision. Some days he was excited, talking about the baby's future. Other days he was cold and distant, as if the pregnancy was a burden. The constant emotional whiplash left her anxious and confused, always trying to anticipate his mood so she could avoid conflict. As she spoke, I felt a growing sense of horror. I had always believed abuse was obvious: raised voices, visible bruises, dramatic moments. I never understood how quiet it could be, how it could live in the space between words, in the fear of saying the wrong thing, in the constant need to please. Listening to her, I realized how deeply wrong I had been. She told me there were nights she cried silently in bed, turning her face into the pillow so he wouldn't hear. Nights she placed both hands on her stomach and whispered promises to the baby, apologizing for the world she was bringing them into. She thought about leaving many times, but fear always stopped her. Fear of not being believed, fear of being judged, fear of raising a child alone, and most of all, fear of what he might do if she tried. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She didn't get angry. She just looked at me with a sadness that cut deeper than any anger could have. I didn't want you to worry, she said, and I kept thinking, maybe I could fix it. Those words shattered me. The idea that my child believed it was her responsibility to fix the person hurting her filled me with a quiet rage. That afternoon, we made a doctor's appointment. I insisted, and she didn't argue. In the waiting room, I watched her clutch her belly, her eyes darting toward every man who walked by, and I understood that the fear hadn't ended just because she was no longer with him. Trauma doesn't disappear when you escape the danger. It follows you, whispers to you, reminds you of everything that could go wrong. The doctor assured us that the baby was okay, that stress had taken a toll, but no immediate harm had been done. I saw relief wash over her face, followed by fresh tears. She cried quietly, covering her mouth, as if she was ashamed of her emotions. I held her hand tightly, grounding both of us in that moment. The baby's heartbeat echoed in the room, steady and strong, and for a brief second, hope flickered between us on the way home. She told me she was afraid he would come looking for her, afraid he would apologize, beg, promise to change, and that she might believe him. That honesty scared me, but it also told me how deeply his control had reached. I reminded her gently that fear and love can feel very similar when you've been manipulated long enough. She didn't respond, but I could see the words sinking in. That night, as she slept in my room, I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathing, watching the rise and fall of her chest. I knew then that this was no longer just about protecting her from him. It was about helping her unlearn the lies she had been forced to live with. It was about reminding her who she was before fear rewrote her identity, and as the house grew quiet again, I promised myself that this time I would not look away. That promise was tested sooner than I expected. The next morning, her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sound slicing through the fragile calm we had built overnight. She jolted awake instantly, eyes wide, breath caught in her throat. I didn't need to ask who it was. The color drained from her face as she stared at the screen, her fingers hovering but unable to move. The fear returned so fast it was terrifying to watch, like a switch had been flipped inside her. I reached over and turned the phone face down, telling her she didn't have to look, that whatever it said could wait. She nodded, but her hands were already shaking. Later, when she felt steadier, she told me about the messages he had been sending for months, messages I had never seen. At first, they were apologetic, full of promises and self-pity. Then they turned sharp and cruel when she didn't respond the way he wanted, love and anger twisted together. Sometimes within the same sentence, "I can't live without you," followed by, "You'll regret this." Hearing those words out loud made my stomach turn. I realized how carefully he had balanced fear and affection, keeping her trapped in confusion, never letting her feel secure enough to leave or strong enough to fight back. She began to talk about the first time he hurt her physically. It wasn't dramatic. She said, no shouting, no witnesses, just a moment when his anger slipped through the mask. He grabbed her arm too hard during an argument, leaving bruises she hid under long sleeves. When she confronted him later, he cried, he apologized, he blamed stress, work, money. Anything except himself, and she believed him. Because believing him was easier than accepting the truth, that was the beginning of the cycle. Hurt, apology, hope, over and over again. As her pregnancy progressed, the violence escalated, not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it was a shove. Sometimes it was blocking her path so she couldn't leave a room. Sometimes it was standing too close, using his size and presence to remind her who had power. He never hit her belly, she said quickly, as if she needed me to know that, as if that somehow made it less terrifying. But the fear was constant, gnawing at her every thought. She learned how to move quietly, how to speak carefully, how to disappear inside herself. There was one night she described that still haunts me. She had woken up feeling the baby move and smiled, placing her hand on her stomach in the dark. He noticed. He asked what she was smiling about. When she told him, his mood shifted instantly. He accused her of loving the baby more than him, of replacing him, of planning a life without him. The argument that followed was relentless. By morning, she was emotionally shattered, apologizing for something that should have been beautiful. Hearing that broke something inside me. He had taken even her joy and twisted it into a weapon. I asked her if anyone else knew. She shook her head. He had convinced her that no one would believe her, that people would say she was overreacting, hormonal, dramatic. He told her she would ruin his life. That she would be responsible for tearing the family apart, and slowly. She began to believe that too. Silence became her shield. Even though it was slowly destroying her, that afternoon, I helped her change the locks. The sound of the old lock clicking open for the last time felt symbolic, like closing a chapter that should have ended long ago. But safety is not just physical. Every noise outside made her jump. Every unfamiliar car slowed her breathing. I could see the battle inside her, part of her relieved. To be away, another part terrified of what would come next. In the evening, she finally checked her phone with me beside her. Dozens of missed calls. Voicemail she didn't want to listen to. messages swinging wildly between apology and accusation. I watched her read them, watched her shoulders tense with each line. When she reached the last one, her face went completely still. "If you don't come back," he had written, "you'll regret embarrassing me." That was the moment her fear hardened into something else. Determination, quiet, trembling, but real. We talked about options, legal help, restraining orders, staying somewhere safe. The words felt heavy, final. Like doors closing behind us, she admitted she was afraid of what he might do when he realized he had truly lost control. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told her fear was valid, but it couldn't be the thing that decided her future anymore. She listened, nodding slowly, absorbing every word. That night, as she lay on the couch with pillows propped behind her back, one hand resting on her belly, she whispered something that stayed with me. "I don't want my child to grow up thinking this is normal." In that sentence, I heard the strength she didn't yet recognize in herself. She wasn't just running away anymore, she was running toward something better. As I turned off the lights and sat in the quiet, I understood that the danger wasn't over in many ways. It was just beginning, but I also understood something else. Something powerful and terrifying all at once. My daughter had finally seen the truth, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. The man she had loved was not the man she needed to fear anymore. The fear itself had become the enemy, and we were preparing to face it head-on. The next few days blurred together in a way that felt unreal, as if time itself had lost its usual shape. We moved through each hour cautiously, measuring every decision, every sound, every step outside the house. I could see how deeply fear had settled into her body, not just in her thoughts, but in her posture, her breathing, the way her eyes constantly searched rooms for exits. Even when she was quiet, even when she smiled faintly, fear was still there, humming beneath the surface, and yet something had shifted. Beneath that fear, there was a new resolve. Fragile but growing, the first thing we did was tell someone else. That step alone took enormous courage. She sat beside me at the dining table, hands folded tightly in her lap, as we spoke to a lawyer recommended by a friend. Her voice shook as she explained what had happened, but she didn't stop. She didn't minimize it, for the first time. She told the truth without softening it to protect someone else. I watched her shoulders straighten slightly with every sentence, as if each word returned a piece of power that had been taken from her. When the call ended, she let out a long breath, almost a sob, and said quietly, "I didn't know saying it out loud would feel like this." It felt like relief mixed with grief. Mourning the years she had lost to silence. We began gathering evidence, photos of bruises she had hidden, messages she had saved but never dared to reread, a journal she had kept secretly, writing late at night when he was asleep. Recording incidents she was afraid she might later doubt herself about. Reading those pages was like stepping into a nightmare I hadn't known she was living. The words were calm, factual, almost detached, but the pain behind them was unmistakable. Each entry was proof, not just for a court, but for herself, proof that it was real. Proof that she hadn't imagined it at the same time. Practical steps had to be taken. We spoke to her doctor again, ensuring both she and the baby were safe. We contacted a support organization, people trained to help women in exactly her situation. They spoke gently but directly, explaining safety plans, warning signs, next steps. I could see how overwhelming it was for her, how the reality of what she was facing pressed down on her all at once. Leaving wasn't just leaving a man, it was dismantling an entire life she had built around him. A home, routines, shared memories. Even when those memories were painful, they were familiar, and familiarity has a dangerous pull. One evening, as we sat together watching the sunset, she confessed something that surprised me. She said she felt guilty. Guilty for leaving. Guilty for taking the baby away from its father. Guilty for causing trouble. The words came out in a rush, tangled and heavy. I listened carefully before responding, because I knew this moment mattered. I told her that responsibility belongs to the person who chooses to harm, not the person who chooses to survive. I told her that protecting herself and her child was not selfish, it was brave. She cried then, openly, without apology, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was watching her break. I felt like I was watching her begin to heal. That illusion of calm shattered the next day when he showed up. I wasn't home at the time. I had stepped out briefly to buy groceries. She was alone. When she heard the knock, her body reacted before her mind could. Her heart raced, her hands went numb, and she froze. Through the window, she saw his car. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but something stopped her from opening the door. She remembered what we had been told. She called me, whispering into the phone, barely able to breathe. I told her to lock herself in the bedroom and call the police by the time I arrived home. Sirens were already approaching. Watching him stand on the porch, anger barely contained beneath forced calm, was one of the most frightening moments of my life. He tried to explain himself, tried to look reasonable, even wounded. He said he just wanted to talk. He said he was worried, but when the officers spoke to him, when they told him to leave, something ugly flashed across his face. The mask slipped. It was brief, but it was enough. Enough to confirm everything she had said, everything she feared. He left that day, but the damage was done. The threat had crossed the threshold of our home that night. She couldn't sleep. She sat upright in bed, listening for sounds that weren't there. Flinching at every creak of the house. I stayed with her, reminding her where she was, that she was not alone. Trauma doesn't obey logic. It doesn't disappear because danger leaves. It lingers, replaying memories, rewriting reality. I told her it was okay to be scared. Healing didn't mean pretending she was fine. In the quiet hours before morning, she placed my hand on her stomach and asked if I could feel the baby move. I could, a small, undeniable flutter beneath my palm, life, stubborn and persistent, continuing despite everything. She smiled softly, tears sliding down her face, and said, "This is why I have to keep going." In that moment, I saw her strength more clearly than ever before, not loud or dramatic, but steady, rooted in love and survival. The road ahead was still uncertain. Court dates loomed. Fear lingered. But something fundamental had changed. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer questioning whether she deserved safety. And as I watched the sky lighten outside the window, I knew that whatever came next, she had crossed a line she would never cross back over. She had chosen herself. She had chosen her child. And that choice, once made, had a power all its own. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of urgency and waiting, as if our lives were paused between two realities. On the surface, things seemed calm. The house was quiet again. No unexpected knocks, no raised voices, no footsteps pacing outside at night. But beneath that calm, tension simmered constantly. We were waiting for the next move, knowing he would not accept losing control so easily. And sure enough, it came not with violence this time, but with words carefully chosen to wound. The messages started again. This time sent through other people. Friends she hadn't spoken to in months suddenly reached out, saying he was worried, that he was confused, that he didn't understand why she had left. Some hinted that maybe pregnancy stress had made her emotional. Others reminded her of the vows she had taken, of forgiveness, of family. Each message felt like another attempt to pull her back into the web she had finally escaped. I watched her read them, watched doubt creep into her expression, and felt my chest tighten with fear. Abuse doesn't always chase you with fists. Sometimes it hunts you with guilt. One evening, she broke down and admitted she was tempted to respond. Not because she wanted to go back, but because she wanted the noise to stop. She wanted him to admit what he had done. She wanted an apology that felt real. I told her gently that closure from an abuser is a dangerous illusion, that apologies can be tools, just like threats. She listened, nodding slowly. But I could tell how hard it was to let go of the hope that he might finally understand the damage he had caused. Then came the call that changed everything. His voice was calm, almost soothing, as if nothing terrible had ever happened. He said he had been thinking, that he wanted to do the right thing, that he was willing to work on himself for the sake of the baby. For a moment, I saw her shoulders relax, her eyes soften. That was when he shifted. His tone sharpened, just slightly, enough to send a chill through the room. He reminded her that he knew where she was. He reminded her that people talk. He reminded her that life could become very difficult if she didn't cooperate. The threat was wrapped so neatly in concern that it took a second to recognize it for what it was. When the call ended, she sat very still. Then she handed me the phone and said, "I don't want to live like this anymore." There was no panic in her voice this time. Just exhaustion, resolve. That was the moment we decided to move forward legally, without hesitation, without compromise. Fear had guided her for too long. Now clarity would have to take its place. The process was overwhelming. Police reports, statements, interviews. She had to recount moments she wanted desperately to forget, describing them in sterile rooms to strangers with notepads. Each retelling reopened wounds. But with each one, something else happened too. Her story stopped being a secret. It became a record. It became truth. Written down, impossible to erase. I sat beside her whenever I could, grounding her when her voice shook, squeezing her hand when memories threatened to pull her under. He responded exactly as we had been warned he would. Denial. Blame. He painted himself as the victim, claiming she was unstable, manipulated by family, overwhelmed by pregnancy. Hearing those lies made my blood boil. But she surprised me. She didn't react with anger or tears. She simply listened, then quietly corrected the record, fact by fact, message by message. She no longer needed him to admit the truth. She carried it within her now. Solid and unshakable, the restraining order was granted on a grey afternoon that felt heavier than most. When the judge read it aloud, outlining the boundaries he was no longer allowed to cross, I saw my daughter exhale, as if she had been holding her breath for years. It wasn't a magic shield. We both knew that. But it was a line drawn in the world outside her mind, a statement that said she mattered, that what had happened to her was real, and that it was wrong. That night, we talked about the future for the first time in a way that didn't feel like a fantasy. She spoke about names again, about creating a home filled with calm, about raising a child who would never confuse fear with love. She admitted she was still scared, that some part of her always would be. But she also said something that made my eyes sting. "I trust myself now," she said. "I didn't before. But I do now." The man who had once controlled her life was losing his power, not because he had changed, but because she had. He could still shout, threaten, manipulate, but his words no longer defined her reality. Watching that transformation was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. I mourned the years she had spent shrinking herself to survive, but I also felt an overwhelming pride. She had walked through fear while carrying a child, through guilt, through doubt, through pressure, and she had not turned back as we prepared for what lay ahead. I understood something with painful clarity. Chapter by chapter, she was reclaiming her story, not as a victim frozen in the moment of escape, but as a woman choosing a different ending, and no matter how hard the next steps might be, she would not take them alone. As the weeks passed, life began to take on a new rhythm, unfamiliar but steadier. The constant tension that had once filled every corner of the house slowly loosened its grip. It didn't disappear entirely, fear doesn't leave all at once, but it no longer ruled every thought. My daughter started sleeping through the night again, not deeply, not always peacefully, but without waking in terror at every sound. In the mornings, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the street come alive, reminding herself that the world was still moving forward and that she was part of it again. Her body began to change in ways that felt hopeful instead of frightening. The baby's movements grew stronger, more frequent, each kick a quiet reassurance that life was continuing despite everything that had tried to stop it. She talked to her belly now, softly and without shame, telling the baby about the room they would sleep in, the light that came through the windows in the afternoon, the sound of birds in the early morning. Those moments were small, almost ordinary, but they felt sacred. They were proof that fear had not won. We began preparing for the future in practical ways: doctor visits, paperwork, planning for the baby's arrival. These tasks grounded her, giving her something solid to focus on. There were days when she felt strong, even hopeful. And days when the weight of what she had survived came crashing down without warning. On those days, she would sit quietly, staring into space, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. I learned not to rush her through those moments. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't move forward in a straight line. Sometimes standing still is progress. One afternoon, she surprised me by asking to go for a walk. It was a simple request, but I knew how much it meant. We walked slowly through the neighborhood, the sun warm on our backs, the world seemingly unaware of the battles that had been fought behind closed doors. She held my arm lightly, not because she couldn't walk on her own, but because she wanted the reassurance. When a man passed us on the sidewalk, she stiffened instinctively, then forced herself to relax. "I hate that my body still reacts before my mind," she said quietly. I told her that her body had kept her alive, that it had learned fear for a reason, and that in time, it would learn safety too. There were moments of grief that caught us both off guard. Grief for the life she thought she was building. Grief for the man she believed her husband was. Grief for the version of herself that had tried so hard to make things work. She allowed herself to mourn now, openly, without blaming herself. That, more than anything, felt like a turning point. She was no longer asking why she wasn't enough. She was asking why she had been made to believe she wasn't. The legal process continued in the background, slow and exhausting, but it no longer consumed her every thought. Boundaries were in place. Support surrounded her. For the first time, she began to imagine a future that didn't include fear as its foundation. She talked about going back to school one day, about creating a home that felt calm and safe, about raising a child who would grow up knowing what real love looked like, not control, not silence, but kindness, respect, and freedom. One evening, as we folded tiny baby clothes together, she paused and looked at me with a seriousness that made my heart tighten. I used to think strength meant enduring, she said. I thought if I could just survive it, it would mean something. Now I know strength is leaving. Strength is choosing a different life. I reached for her hands, overwhelmed by how far she had come. The girl who once whispered apologies for existing was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood her worth. As her due date approached, excitement mixed with fear in ways that felt almost unbearable at times. The thought of becoming a mother brought joy, but it also brought memories of how vulnerable she had felt. We talked about it openly, acknowledging both emotions without letting either take over. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was facing everything as it came, with honesty and courage. On a quiet morning not unlike the one when she first knocked on my door, she stood in the doorway of her room and watched the sunlight spill across the floor. She placed her hand on her belly and smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "I'm not running anymore," she said softly. "I'm building something." That sentence carried more power than all the fear that had come before it. I thought back to that dawn, to the weak knock, to the terror in her eyes, to the way she had clung to me as if I were the last safe place in the world. And I realized that while that moment had broken my heart, it had also revealed something extraordinary. My daughter had found the courage to save herself and her child. She had chosen life over fear, truth over silence, hope over despair. The journey wasn't over. It never really is. But as I watched her prepare for motherhood, stronger and more aware than ever before, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The man she had run from no longer defined her story. The dawn that once marked her escape had become the beginning of a new life, one built not on survival alone, but on freedom, love, and an unshakable belief in her own strength. The morning she finally slept peacefully, the house felt different, lighter, calmer, as if it too had been waiting for her to be safe. I watched my pregnant daughter rest, one hand on her belly, her face no longer tense with fear but softened by quiet strength. That weak knock at dawn had changed everything. It had exposed a truth that was painful, terrifying, and necessary. She didn't come to my door looking for comfort. She came looking for life, for safety, for a future for herself and her child. She is no longer running. She is choosing. Choosing protection over silence, courage over fear, and love that does not hurt. Her journey reminds us that abuse does not always look violent at first, and strength does not always roar. Sometimes strength arrives barefoot at dawn, trembling, and still brave enough to ask for help. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more real, emotional stories of survival, truth, and hope. Share this video with someone who may need the reminder that they are not alone. Your support helps give a voice to those still suffering in silence. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for believing, because every story told brings someone closer to safety, and every subscriber helps keep these stories alive.